So we often talk about, at least when I give the meditation instruction, I talk about just being aware of the stories that we tell ourselves and how we get hooked into them. And I want to talk today about about how we just tend to take them as the truth, and especially the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. When we sit down to meditate, we see how easily it is to get caught up in those stories, and then of course it happens when we're not meditating, but it's usually a little easier to see then. And they typically involve for each of us individually pretty familiar scripts or narratives that have become predictable habits of mind over the decades, as we rehash them. And it's why I always suggest to just learn to watch them, not get hooked by them as they sort of flicker by our screen of consciousness. Because one of the things that happens is when we get caught up in the stories, we stop being present to our own experience. We stop being present to that moment. And but what if we instead of believing them and just accepting them as truth, we look more closely at them and we recognize that the self stories that are built into our lives are something that we can sort of explore at a deeper level. As the Buddha pointed out in various ways and in various teachings, these stories have powerful consequences for how we live our lives. In other words, we inhabit a world in which the existence of this self, which we each have, is situated at the center of what we experience. So the stories, we inhabit that world of our stories, basically. And they typically, we tell ourselves stories that include the past, the present, and the future, and that can jump back and forth simultaneously, move around. But once we begin to realize that we always are inhabiting stories, we realize that moment is not where we're fully present. It's not where we really live. And as the Buddha taught, yes, the self story operates, but we can see it as just another dimension of the understanding of the conditioning that we accept. And we usually accept that conditioning without challenge, without questioning it. And the reason, part of the reason these stories appeal to us is because they provide us with explanations. They sort of give order or reason to our world. Um, and often we see the stories as just common sense. This is what everyone knows. This is true about me, and on and on. We don't really question them or hold them up to scrutiny, but that doesn't make them true. That doesn't make them so. So if we accept that we're always living our stories, we can see that a lot of our practice can be about changing the stories, about inhabiting a new story. You recall the teachings on the Four Noble Truths, especially the first noble truth about the reality of suffering in our lives, is really, I think, we can view that as an invitation to live a different story or different stories. But we have to pay attention to them, and we have to step back and view them, uh, view these habitual stories as just that, stories, not accept them at face value as the truth with a capital T. So that's our challenge. The good news is that the Dharma offers us many ways to change these lived stories. For example, if we reflect on the impermanence of all things, which become a part of the story we live, um, you know, th- then we can see that things are ever changing, that these fixed notions of who we don't necessarily hold up. Instead of holding tightly to some fixed identity of self in a world of other fixed identities, we see we live in a flow of shifting events where past, present, and future are in constant flux. They're not solid. Because of impermanence, none of our stories are fixed stories. I'm not always one way. I'm not always impatient. I'm not always kind or compassionate. I'm not always alert. I'm not always this. There's no fixed me, despite the stories I tell myself. And it's easier to see this process during meditation when we're quiet, when we can watch them, than when we're running around, during our busy days. But by learning to be aware of the stories that we live, the stories that guide and inform our lives, we can change things in important ways. So when we remove these stories from the realm of just what we take for granted, we open up to a different dimension of lived experience. The Buddha taught that the grasping and claims of ownership that come with our stories are the source of tremendous suffering, especially when those stories are negative, self-critical, self-denigrating, and so forth. Don't we know this when we start ruminating on a negative story, a negative, picture of ourselves? He says that, the Buddha offered other stories in its place, such as the story that all things and including ourselves are impermanent, constantly changing, and this includes this presumed identity, this fixed identity of who we are. If we replaced the lived story of me, whatever that is, at the center of our lives, the story that's been conditioned since childhood, which we've accepted, with the story of impermanence and constant change, life starts to look very differently. Now, this practice is challenging. I don't mean to suggest otherwise, because often we don't even see our stories as stories. We just see them as our identity. We just see them as, this is who I am. But again, there's nothing that says that that version of me is the truth with a capital T. So we have to begin by acknowledging how thoroughly our experience is shaped by these old and recurring stories that we live with, that we live by. Focusing on the stories, seeing them as just stories, helps us recognize that this world we inhabit and experience is much more mental, meaning story driven, than we usually recognize. But remember, the story is just a story. When people would come into me and say, "Oh, I'm an anxious person," it's just a story. Yes, anxiety may be happening in their life, but to sort of label themselves globally that way, it's just a story. It's not objective truth. They're just describing an experience, but they're so identified with that experience through the story that they can't get any daylight in there. They can't get any separation from that. They're so overly identified with themselves in a certain way. And I'm not saying we have to turn away from them or get rid of them, which we couldn't do, but we can see them as simply stories. We can just say, oh, here's another story about Jeff that's arising. Oh, yeah, that's a familiar one. I've lived with that my whole life, but it's just a story. But we can't do this without mindful present moment awareness when the stories arise. And our sitting practice is the practice to begin to do that. When I'm sitting in meditation, the stories start to come up. I can say, oh, there's another story. It's a filter. It's just the filter through which we view and experience ourselves in the world. But we get lost in that content. We buy into it. And when we do that, we stop being present with our own experience. Now, these stories are complex, they're multidimensional, but they're just stories, okay? By not buying into the stories we tell ourselves, by not accepting the truth of them, we draw closer to being free, we draw closer to reducing our suffering. So it's learning to get some daylight in there between the story and who I think I am. When I can catch that, when I can say, oh, that's just another story, there's a freedom in that. There's a releasing that of some kind of negative self-perception that I've carried probably my whole life. Some message I got growing up from parents or siblings or peers or whatever, but it's just another story. And the Buddha beautifully understood this, that there is an essential part of us that is free of stories that we can identify with, tap into, and live with greater freedom and less suffering. So that's stories. Let's get your thoughts on that.